Welcome to the next installment in my video lecture series in economics. And in this particular video lecture, I'm going to be taking a look at the effect of a commodity tax on supply. This is in my public finance course, and it relates to tax incidence in competitive markets. So first off, we're going to start with a very simplified example where demand is perfectly elastic. We're going to look at other scenarios, but just for this purpose, we're going to have a horizontal demand curve. And also, since this is a competitive market, we know that the marginal cost curve above average variable cost is the supply curve for firms. So that's why this supply curve is annotated as equaling marginal cost. So we have supply equals demand. That gives us the equilibrium price P0 and the equilibrium quantity Q0. If a tax is imposed upon the supplier, we want to have an idea of how that impacts the supplier. Well, what it does is they want to charge more for that particular product. So if the equilibrium is Q0 and the equilibrium price is P0, they want to add on the tax to that price. So for every single quantity for this original supply curve, marginal cost curve, they want to add the tax on for every quantity. So the vertical distance between the original supply curve before the tax and the new supply curve after the tax is going to be equal to the per unit tax that's being placed, or sometimes we refer to it in a textbook as a specific tax, i.e. a certain amount per unit, like $1 per gallon. It's not a percentage amount. So we could do that for every point, and for us, we're just going to do it for 2, and that gives us the new supply curve after the tax is being instituted, because now marginal cost is equal to marginal cost plus the tax. And what does this do? It lowers the equilibrium quantity because we have a perfectly elastic demand curve. So make sure you realize that if you're taxing the supplier, the tax is changing the cost structure of the supplier, and that the supply curve shifts to the left. Some people will say it shifts upward, but the vertical distance between the original supply curve and the new supply curve is equivalent to the per unit tax that is placed upon the supplier. So let's take a look at this if we have more standard looking supply curves. We have the demand curve, which is downward sloping, supply curve before the tax, which is upward sloping. So what happens if a tax is instituted on a supplier? The supply curve is going to shift upward equivalent to the amount of the tax. So again, the vertical distance is equal to the tax. We have a horizontal shifting, that the two curves are parallel to one another. The supply curve, the slope of the supply curve doesn't change. Okay, the intercept on the y-axis changes the equivalent amount of the tax. So the vertical distance between the supply curve before the tax versus after the tax is equal to the amount of that per unit tax. So at that original quantity Q0, that original equilibrium quantity, the supplier wants to charge P0 plus the tax, right? They want to pass that tax on to consumers. So at Q0, now they want, where they were previously charging P0, now they want to charge P0 plus the tax. The problem with this is demanders don't want to buy Q0 at that higher price. They want to buy less than that. They want to buy Q1. So under the original supply curve before the tax, the equilibrium was P0 and Q0. The supplier tries to pass that tax on to consumers in the form of a higher price by adding the tax onto the per unit price. Consumers don't want to pay P0 plus T plus the tax for that original equilibrium amount. They're only willing to buy less than that because the higher the price goes, the less the quantity demanded. So what has to happen in order for us to get to equilibrium is that the price has to lower until we get to the point where the original demand curve intersects the new supply curve after the tax. So the supplier attempts to pass this tax on to consumers, but consumers say, no, we're not willing to buy the same amount at that higher price. We're only willing to buy more if the price goes down. And in order to eliminate the surplus, the supplier lowers the price until the surplus disappears and we get to the new equilibrium. So let's take a look at what this looks like graphically at the very end. So we have our original price, the original equilibrium price, P0 and Q0. The tax is instituted that shifts the supply curve upward a vertical distance equivalent to the tax. All right, so the new equilibrium is PAT. That's the price after the tax. So the equilibrium price after the tax, and here's the equilibrium quantity. But that's what consumers are paying. What are the suppliers actually receiving? They get the price after the tax increase, but they have to pay the tax. So for example, if the new equilibrium is $6 and they have to pay $1 for every unit they sell, they're only receiving $5. So we have the equilibrium price less the tax is the price that's going to be received by the sellers of the product. So make sure you realize that A, what happens when a tax is imposed upon a supplier? This impacts the supply curve. It shifts, and the vertical distance between the original supply curve and the new supply curve is equivalent to the tax. Okay? We get a new equilibrium where the demand curve, original demand curve, intersects the new supply curve, and that's the new equilibrium price. However, the sellers do not get that price because they're responsible for paying the tax. So what they actually receive after the tax is the new equilibrium price less the tax.